Are you trying to paint more loosely and create a more painterly look with your pastels? Do you like the expressive styles of master pastelists like Jacob Aguiar and Tony Elaine and Marla Baguetta? But you're not sure how to develop that expressiveness? Or maybe you want a way to explore and develop your own style? Well, I have the perfect solution for you, and it only takes 5 minutes. Well, okay, you're not going to learn to paint expressively in 5 minutes, but the exercise I'm going to show you only takes 5 minutes each time you do it. Let me show you what I mean. So painting loosely doesn't come naturally. Well, maybe to some genius artists, but for most of us, it doesn't. And so it's something that we have to practice and we have to develop. It's a skill that you can work on. If you've ever seen a beautifully expressive painting and wished you could paint like that, like the work of the Mad Charcoal guy, Josh Hernandez, wow, his work is just incredible. Well, you can paint like that. It just takes practice, lots of practice, and the right kind of practice. If you're having trouble loosening up when you're painting and being more expressive, it's because the way that you're practicing is not developing that skill. If you keep painting the same way that you've always painted, you're never going to paint any differently, which sounds ridiculously obvious, but it's true. If every time you practice, you always paint the same way that you've always painted, then you're never going to develop a different style. You're never going to be more expressive if you've never been expressive before. I mean, how many of us keep wishing that we are more expressive or we are looser with our style, but we keep doing the same thing over and over and over again? So it's really very simple. If you want to paint differently, you have to paint differently. There, problem solved. The end. Now go make something. Well, we all wish it were that simple, but it might be simpler than you think. You might just need to practice differently and practice in the right ways. So how do you do that? I'm glad you asked. So first, developing a familiarity with what your pastels can do and the marks you can make is very important. But before I dive into that, I want to give a bit of a disclaimer. Simply knowing some mark-making techniques is not enough. That knowledge alone won't allow you to loosen up and develop your style. To do that, the mark-making needs to become more natural. And for it to become more natural, you'll need lots of practice and the right kind of practice. So I'm going to show you a little bit later an exercise that you can follow to develop that practice, so keep watching. But here are some of the types of mark making that you should be aware of and learn to use. And notice that for most of these techniques, you should use the side of your pastel stick. Also, I'm using a sanded pastel paper, which is great for holding pastel pigment and providing texture. This paper is called Fisher 400. Currently, this type of paper is very difficult to find because of production problems, but a great option that's very similar and more popular than this is the UART 400. So let's talk about some mark-making techniques. The first technique, and the one that you're going to use the most, is called scumbling. And scumbling is simply dragging the side of your pastel across the paper to create texture. It's very light marks. And if you take this pastel and apply it over this background that I was preparing as you were watching a minute ago, I can scumble over that. And you can see the contrast between these complementary colors and the effect that's created. So scumbling is a mark-making technique that you'll use in pastel all the time, and it's great for creating texture and for starting to lay down your color base. Then of course you're going to need some thicker marks in your pastel painting. You can apply heavy pressure on the side of your pastel stick and get these nice thick marks that we're used to seeing in our chunky pastel pieces. And at the same time, you can use the side of your pastel to create those thin marks. Harder pastels like Nupastels are great for this because they're easier to control. They put less pastel down. But if you need a thin line, using the side of your stick is very helpful. Now, pastels come in different shapes and sizes, obviously. Some are rounded and some are squared off. The squared off edges are the best for creating these little sharp marks. But if you do have some rounded pastels, such as a Sennelier or a Schmincke, these are great as well. Not only can you use the side of it to make those thick marks, but you can also roll the edge along and create some interesting marks that are very thin. Tree branches, grasses. This is great. You just try to roll that along the edge and it'll make some neat marks there. So you're going to want to vary your marks in your painting and use them in the appropriate places, obviously, but you're going to need some broad, expressive marks. If you're trying to create the base of some foliage in a tree, laying down those broadly and expressively in a smooth way is going to create some effects that you can't get any other way. And the extra pressure is really going to lay that pastel down. And then very similar to the scumbling method is a staccato sketchy method that you can use as well. I use this a lot, second to the scumbling method, where you're just trying to, very short strokes, represent maybe a tree trunk or several tree trunks together, and it's controlled just within a certain area, certain width. And these little sketchy marks allow you to get that expressiveness without being too broad and without making a mark that's too big. And then you've got your sharp marks. These are especially good for details. So at the very end, you're using a square pastel. These corners are great for making little sharp marks. So if I want to create some foliage, I can create these sharp marks for some texture. And the rounded pastels, same thing. They're great for this too. Maybe a little twist on the end. Use different sides of the pastel, use different edges, and get some unique and interesting marks. So these are the basic mark making techniques with pastels, and knowing about them is very helpful. Knowing what you can do with pastels is very helpful. Go explore, try these out, and see what you can accomplish with your pastel sticks. But just knowing about them is not enough. There's still a problem. So knowing these mark making techniques is one thing, but putting them into practice is another thing. As I mentioned earlier, to paint more loosely and expressively, you have to follow these mark making techniques, but they have to flow naturally from you. They have to become yours. You have to do them in your way. So obviously becoming more natural with these mark making techniques takes a lot of practice, takes the right kind of practice. So I'm going to show you an exercise that can help you. But before I show you the exercise, there's a common misconception that we need to tackle first. Listen carefully. Looseness is not the opposite of precision and accuracy. You may look at the realistic work of Michael Freeman and the detail and the realism he's able to produce, and then you look over at somebody like Andrew McDermott and his urban, expressive scenes, and you might think, well, Michael is more precise and accurate than Andrew. And that's not the case at all. That's not the right way to look at it. In fact, if you look closely at Andrew's scenes, the reason that they work is because although he's loose and expressive, you know what he's painting. His cars look like cars. And if he wasn't precise in his mark making and accurate in his proportions, then you wouldn't know that they were cars. They would look funny, they would look ridiculous, they would stand out, and it wouldn't look as good as it does. So just because he's loose doesn't mean he's not accurate. They go hand in hand. You have to be precise in your expressiveness and in your looseness. And in fact, in order to paint loosely and expressively, you have to work on your precision first. If you don't have good precise skills, if you don't have good drawing skills, then your looseness and your expressiveness is just going to make a mess. So let me show you an exercise that will help your expressiveness and your precision. But before I show you that, if you're finding this content helpful, then please like this video and subscribe to my channel. If not, that's okay too. Now let's get to the exercise. Okay, so we're going to use just one color in this exercise. Pick something fun, enjoyable, pick your favorite color, pick something that will make this exercise more fun for you. And notice here that I'm laying out some measuring marks on the side. These are just quick 1/3 marks along the edges. This is going to help me to maintain my proportions and to know where things are supposed to go. So I've started in on my foreground first. Notice how lightly I'm applying the pastel. And that's key as you're doing this exercise. you want to focus on light strokes. This is scumbling, like we talked about earlier. This is that mark making technique that you're going to use over and over again in your pastel paintings. So you want to lightly scumble, lightly sketch the pastel onto the surface. Now it really helps if you use a harder pastel like a Nupastel, a Cretacolor, a Rembrandt. In this case, I'm using a Nupastel. If you use a pastel that's too soft, you're going to lay down too much pigment at once, and it's going to fill your tooth. It's going to be harder to control. And so if you're new to this, especially new to this exercise, new to pastel painting, pick a harder pastel to do this exercise with. So I'm using a harder pastel. I'm using a warm color here. I'm probably going to use this as an underpainting for another painting I'm going to do later. And so I'm starting off with something that I think I can use in the future. Now about 2 to 3 minutes into this exercise, you're going to want to stop, briefly step back, and take a look at what you've done so far. Is it accurate? Are the trees in the right place? Is the water in the right place? Are the clouds in the right place? Are they the right size? Are they the right shape? And you're going to want to make some adjustments if they're not. Make sure you compare to your reference photo, and you're trying to be precise. Remember, this is not just about looseness and expressiveness, this is about precision as well. All right, after that brief break, you can resume your exercise and use the final 2 to 3 minutes to make sure that you focus on your values, getting the lights and the darks in the right place. Because we're using a light pastel paper here, we want to make sure that all the lights are left light by not applying any pastel to those areas. And for those darks, we can work up to that dark value. We don't have to get it all at once. Put several light layers down until you get the value and intensity that you're looking for in those dark areas. So there are only 3 things to consider when you're doing this exercise. Number 1 is values, so lights and darks, trying to get a sense of where they should go and how much pressure to apply to get the darker values. So number 1 is values. Number 2 is expressive mark making. We're going faster here, we're trying to stay looser, we're using the side of our pastel, not the end, we're not focusing on details. We're going expressive and loose and just trying to represent the shapes in the scene as quickly as we can. Make sure you're always using light pressure. When in doubt, always think light. And then number 3, we're focused on precision. We want to make sure that the proportions, that the drawing, that the size and shape of the objects is correct, is accurate to the reference photo. All right, after 5 minutes, you're done. Finished, walk away. And then you can do this exercise again. You can use the same scene if you want, the same reference photo, the same colors, or mix it up, do something else. Make sure you keep it fun, make sure you keep it engaging so that you can do this exercise again and again and again and again. It only takes 5 minutes, doesn't take very long. It can be fun to do, and so you can do this over and over and over again. So obviously, like with any practice, repetition is key. Go fast and loose, but focus on the precision. Make sure the proportions, the shapes, the sizes are correct in your scene. So here's a second exercise. This time I'm going to use 2 colors and that's it. You could go up to 3 if you really wanted to, but I would really stick to 1 or 2 colors and simplify what we're doing in the exercise. Now, while I'm laying out my measuring marks along the edges, again, my 1/3 marks, let's talk about why this exercise is so helpful and why it can really help you be more expressive. Number 1, this exercise is helpful because it forces you to work faster. You only have 5 minutes to complete it. Make sure you stick to that. Set a timer if you need to. Go fast and go loose and be expressive with your mark making. We're not drawing details. We're just drawing shapes. We're just sketching out the scene. And so you can be fast and loose, and it can help train your brain to think in that fast and loose way. Number 2, this can help your accuracy become more natural. Instead of tightening up like you're drawing with a pencil and getting into all the details and making sure all the lines are correct, you're forced to get that precision quickly. And so if you do that over and over again, you force yourself to try to be precise very quickly. It will become more natural. It will become second nature. That hand-eye coordination will develop more quickly, and you'll be able to lay out the scene accurately much more quickly. So number 3, this exercise is helpful like so many other exercises because it removes a lot of other considerations and just focuses on a few things. If you're going to develop into a good artist, you have so many skills that you need to work on. Your drawing has to be accurate. Your color theory has to be spot on. You have to understand composition. You have to understand texture and mark making. And it can be overwhelming to your brain to try to think about all those things at once. So if you're always trying to paint a full scene, then you're going to be overwhelming yourself. But if you do an exercise like this, it focuses in on a few key things. And as we mentioned earlier, the few key things we're focusing on in this exercise are our values, which is the least important, and our precision and our expressiveness. And so we remove the other considerations like color and details and allow your brain just to focus in on the things that will help you to develop into a more expressive painter. So as I mentioned before, you're going to want to do this exercise over and over again, and it's going to feel a little awkward at first if you haven't done anything like this before. But after a while, it'll get better. But let's say by the 5th or 6th time you've done this exercise, it still feels really awkward, and you're not making any progress in terms of your proportions and your shapes and getting things the right size based on what your reference photo is telling you. Well, then you may have another problem. You may need to work on your drawing or your drafting skill. And that may mean that you need to sit down and just spend some hours with a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil and just draw. Just look out into your world around you, find something to draw, and try to reproduce it accurately. Not all the details necessarily, it doesn't have to be realistic looking, but the shapes and sizes. You want to work on your proportions, you want to work on the shapes, the sizes of things, and make sure that's accurate. I don't know any master artist out there that hasn't done this. And so you need to put in the time to make sure that you're drawing and make sure that you can develop that skill. See, even when you're being expressive, size, proportion, shape matter so much. That accuracy and precision is so important. So developing that drawing skill is really going to enhance your expressiveness. So to loosen up your painting style, do this exercise over and over and over and over again. It only takes 5 minutes each time. It's fun to do. You can do it over and over again and really develop your expressive mark making and develop your fast precision. And now if you're thinking about doing this exercise over and over and over again, you might be thinking about the cost, because pastels are not cheap. Premium pastel paper is also not cheap. The good news is that most premium pastel papers like UART and the Fisher 400 that I'm using here and Pastelmat, you can wash them off and reuse them. You won't completely get rid of the image that was there before, but you'll wash out a lot of that pigment and it will relieve some of that tooth and you can use it over again. And also these exercises make great underpaintings, so you can get a head start on some other pieces that you want to do down the road. So here's a bonus tip. If you're new to pastels or you're just exploring and you haven't invested in some of those more premium pastel supplies and paper yet, or you're just worried about the cost of doing this over and over and over again, you can do this exercise very cheaply. Go down to your local hobby store and pick up a couple sticks of charcoal and a pad of cheap charcoal paper, some textured paper, and then just go to town. You can do the same thing, the same principles apply with charcoal on paper. And that'll be an easy, inexpensive way to do this exercise over and over again and develop your expressive mark making. Okay, so I've got a challenge for you. Go do this exercise every day for the next 2 weeks, at least once a day. It only takes 5 minutes. It won't take much of your time, but it will be fun. It'll be engaging. It will help you develop your expression and your precision in your painting. Again, if you found this video helpful, please consider liking it, subscribing to my channel. If you do subscribe, hit that notification bell so you know when a new video comes out. And as always, go make something.